Thalos 9 didn't have mornings, just a slow, grinding shift from one shade of artificial gray to another. Light never quite reached the edges of the station, and the hum of machinery never stopped long enough to notice the passing of time. The entire orbital colony pulsed with life only because it refused to die. The corridors were narrow, the walls streaked with rust-colored grime that no one bothered to clean. Air recyclers stuttered in the background like old lungs. The stench of sweat, oil, and scorched metal clung to every surface like a second skin. It wasn't the kind of place where people dreamed of living. It was where you ended up when there was nowhere else left to go. Darren Vale knew that better than most. He was an engineer, more accurately, a glorified mechanic who kept the bones of Thalos 9 from crumbling. He patched leaking vents, calibrated overworked processors, rewired fried circuits in the guts of the mining shafts. He kept his head down, his mouth shut, and his hands busy. That's how you survived here. Not by being a hero, just by not drawing attention. But something changed that day, something he didn't expect. It was supposed to be a routine diagnostics check near Shaft C. One of the ore crushers had gone offline again, probably fried from overuse. He was crouched down, wrist deep in a mess of cabling when he saw her. At first, he thought she was part of the wall, just another figure slumped in the shadows during a sanctioned break. They always sat like that, hunched over, silent, defeated. The indentured workers, the assets, as the company called them. Most were aliens, debt-bonded laborers sold off by their governments or families to settle colonial disputes or failed harvests. Corporate euphemisms wrapped around slavery. But this one didn't sit like the others. She was upright, chained to a support beam, yes, iron cuffs at her wrists, and a collar that blinked with a tracker's red light. But her spine was straight. Her head was tilted ever so slightly, as if listening to something beneath the endless mechanical roar. Her skin was a dusky violet, bruised in some places, but still striking in the sterile light. Long black hair fell in matted strands over her shoulders, streaked with grime. But her face was still sharp, high cheekboned and severe, like she refused to be worn down by the filth surrounding her, and her eyes, large, silver gray, catching the light like mirrors, were open, watching him, not afraid, not desperate, just present. Darren blinked, looked away, tried to focus on the capacitor in front of him, but the soldering iron trembled slightly in his hand. He wasn't supposed to look. That was Rule 1. Don't interact. Don't acknowledge them. Don't give the overseers a reason to think you care. He'd followed that rule for 5 years. He'd walked past dozens, hundreds of chained workers just like her. Broken bodies, hollow eyes. He never flinched, never stepped in. That was the deal you made when you came to Thalos 9. Ignore enough pain, and eventually it fades into the background hum. But she hadn't faded. She stood out like a raw nerve. He didn't know why. Maybe it was the stillness in her, the absence of fear. Maybe it was the way she didn't blink when their eyes met. She didn't look away. Neither did he. Not until a voice cracked over the loudspeakers, announcing the end of rest cycle. He left an extra hydration pack by the maintenance panel before he walked away. Just set it down like he'd forgotten it. He didn't watch to see if she picked it up, but the next day she was there again. And this time, when he glanced her way, she held his gaze just a second longer. Not curiosity, not gratitude, recognition. It gnawed at him for the rest of the day. Back in his bunk, he sat staring at the peeling ceiling, unable to sleep. He told himself it was nothing. She was just another worker, another alien sent here to die for corporate profits. He'd seen worse. So why couldn't he stop thinking about her? Her skin had felt like it carried the cold of deep space. That wasn't normal. He wasn't sure what species she was. Korani, maybe? He'd only heard of them, low-light dwellers from an agrarian world with moons so bright the night never truly came. Fragile-looking, but deceptively strong, adapted for survival in ways humans didn't quite understand. Some said they could see in complete darkness, that their nervous systems processed pain differently. She looked like someone who'd been in pain a long time and had grown used to it. He started changing his shift routes, quietly. No one noticed. Maintenance logs were easy enough to forge if you knew the system, and Darren had rewritten most of the code on Thalos 9 just to keep it running. He timed his rounds so he passed near Shaft C during her breaks. He kept pretending it was coincidence. He started leaving small things. A nutrient bar, another water pack. Once even a rag soaked in a basic antiseptic solution. She never acknowledged him, never spoke, but she took them. And every time she did, a small, wordless agreement seemed to settle between them. Darren wasn't proud of how long he'd kept quiet over the years. There were times he'd seen worse than chains, workers beaten for moving too slow, for coughing too loud. Once, a man had died 10 feet from him, electrocuted by a faulty panel Darren hadn't been allowed to shut down. He still remembered the smell of cooked flesh and the quiet shrug the overseer gave. Not worth the repair time, they'd said. He hadn't said a word, but this was different. He didn't know her name, didn't know her story, but something about her cracked open a part of him he'd buried a long time ago. He remembered something his father once told him before he'd left Earth for good. The moment you stop caring, son, you're not surviving. You're just waiting to die. He hadn't thought about that in years. He started wondering what she was like before the chains, before Thalos 9, what her voice sounded like, whether she'd seen real stars instead of this artificial sky, this endless mechanical twilight. And he wondered, quietly, dangerously, how much longer he could stand to just walk past her and pretend she wasn't there. Something had shifted, something small but irreversible. In a station built on silence and submission, Darren Vale had made a choice. He'd noticed her, and that was the beginning of everything. Darren told himself it was just curiosity, that he was only paying attention because he hadn't seen one of her kind before, that it didn't mean anything, but curiosity doesn't make a man reroute his work schedule. It doesn't make him memorize guard patrol patterns, and it certainly doesn't make him wake up in the middle of the night thinking about violet skin and silver eyes staring back like they could see past his bones. The next few days blurred into a strange rhythm. Work, repair, observe, disappear. He grew sharper, more precise in his routes. He started timing his movements like a machine, leaving only the smallest margins of error. The risk was real, and he knew it. The overseers weren't subtle with punishment. If they even suspected him of sympathizing, they'd strip his contract in a breath and throw him down with the rest. No trial, no warning. But he couldn't stop. He started noticing the way she moved. Calculated, controlled. She never wasted energy. Every motion was deliberate, even when her body screamed exhaustion. Her limbs were thinner than they should have been, shoulders narrower than he remembered from the first day, and yet there was no slack in her posture, no collapse. Something about that strength unsettled him more than if she'd been broken. Then, one night, everything changed. He was in subsection 3A, faking a sensor calibration report when he heard it. Metal striking metal, a sharp clatter that didn't match the ambient station hum. He ducked instinctively, pressed into the shadows behind a bulkhead. A patrol passed by, boots heavy against the grates, and after a moment, silence returned. That's when he saw her. She was crouched in the corner of a maintenance access tunnel, partially hidden behind an open conduit panel. Chains hung loose at her side, her collar still blinking faintly, but her expression was different now. She looked alert, like she'd just survived something. And then, quietly, barely audible over the distant hiss of steam, she spoke. "Why do you keep leaving things for me?" Her voice was low, dry from dehydration but clear, measured, as if she'd waited a long time to ask. Darren stepped forward slowly, his heart thudding. "You've been watching me?" he asked. She didn't answer. "I figured you might need them," he said, glancing toward her wrist, where the skin was raw beneath the cuff. "Didn't think you'd notice who it came from." "I notice everything," she said, and there was no pride in it, just fact. "You're different." Darren exhaled, shifting his weight. "They sell us that story when we first sign on here," he said, "that we're not supposed to care, that you're just property." Her gaze didn't flicker. "But I've seen what happens when people stop seeing each other as people," he added, more to himself than to her. "And I don't want to be that." A pause. "My name is Lysera." The sound of it made his chest tighten unexpectedly. It was the first real thing he'd learned about her, and yet it felt like something sacred. "I'm Darren," he said. She nodded once, but didn't say anything more. That should have been the end of it. A quiet, strange moment in the underbelly of a station no one cared about. A single crack in the steel routine. But it wasn't. They began to meet in secret, never planned, never agreed upon, but somehow always at the right time. A flicker in the lights, a sudden sensor failure, a side panel that didn't quite seal. He made those things happen, subtly, carefully, and she started to talk. Not much at first. A sentence here, a quiet breath there. But every word revealed something. She'd been sold to the mining corps after her family defaulted on a harvest loan, promised honest labor, repayment, eventual release. Instead, she was beaten within a week and locked into permanent servitude. Her planet, Quran, had no say, no embassy, no voice. "They took my name when they chained me," she said one night. "I kept it here." She tapped the side of her head. "But I didn't speak it until now." Darren listened. He didn't try to fix it, didn't offer sympathy. He just sat with her, his back against the same cold wall, eyes fixed on the same cracked ceiling panel. In return, she asked him questions. About Earth, about oceans, about what real sunlight felt like. He tried to describe it, but his words felt clumsy, too small. "It's warm," he said, "but not just on your skin. It feels like it pulls something out of you. Like hope." She smiled, faint but real. "You speak like someone who forgot how it feels." He looked down at his hands. "Maybe I did." A silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, just heavy with things unsaid. Then without warning, she reached forward. Her fingers brushed his, tentative but purposeful. It wasn't romantic, not yet. It wasn't dramatic or cinematic. It was human. That touch lingered longer than it needed to. And when she pulled her hand away, he felt the absence like a hole in his chest. Later, alone in his bunk, he couldn't stop replaying the moment, the weight of her fingers, the strength in that subtle connection. He hadn't felt anything real in years. Not since his brother died in a station accident no one investigated, not since he started silencing parts of himself just to keep going. But Lysera didn't let him forget. With nothing more than a look, she pulled every buried part of him back into the light. And that terrified him more than anything. Because now, he couldn't pretend not to care. Now, when he walked past the overseers and saw their batons, when he passed rooms with muffled screams and saw the flicker of red collars, it wasn't just noise, it was a threat. And if he wasn't careful, it wouldn't just be her life in danger, it would be both of theirs. Still, the next day, he left her another nutrient bar. A real one, not the rationed garbage the station handed out. And this time, when she took it, she looked at him like she already knew what he hadn't dared say aloud. That something had begun, something neither of them could walk away from. The descent into the mines felt like falling into the lungs of a dying god. The lift groaned under the weight of the labor unit as it dropped toward the lower shafts of Thalos 9. Steam hissed from fractured vents. The walls, lined with decades of corrosion and soot, trembled with every shudder of the ancient machinery. The farther down it traveled, the less the air seemed like something worth breathing, hot, stale, tinged with the bitter bite of ozone and something else. Zarium dust. It lingered like ash in the throat. Darren stood just outside the loading bay, arms folded, pretending to review diagnostics on his data slate. But his eyes kept drifting, searching for her. There. Lysera stood near the rear of the platform, chained like the others. Her wrists were bound to the steel belt that ran across her hips, restricting movement just enough to remind her she wasn't free. Her posture remained maddeningly upright, even as the others slumped from exhaustion. The guards barked orders, herding the workers into rows with the sharp end of stun prods. Most didn't even flinch anymore. Conditioning, Darren thought. You beat someone long enough, they stop trying to avoid it. But Lysera's gaze remained steady. She didn't speak. She never did when they were around. But for the briefest moment, as the lift doors started to seal, her eyes met his. And in that glance, something passed between them, something unspoken, not gratitude, not even hope. Recognition. The lift vanished into darkness, taking her down into the belly of Thalos 9, and Darren felt something cold settle in his chest. He wasn't supposed to feel this way. He wasn't supposed to feel anything. But here he was, lying to the system, altering logs and rerouting maintenance cycles, all so he could be near her. He forced himself to breathe and tapped a command into his slate. He'd already programmed a stage malfunction in one of the coolant valves. Nothing dangerous, just enough to grant him authorization to descend into the lower levels. He told himself it was to keep an eye on the machinery, but that was a lie. It was for her. The secondary lift rumbled as it took him down. The lights flickered, casting sickly shadows across the walls. As he dropped deeper, the heat grew oppressive. Filters buzzed above, overwhelmed, struggling to scrub toxins from the air. Sweat formed at the base of his spine, clinging to his shirt. The moment the doors opened, he stepped into a world of noise and smoke. The mine was alive with chaos. Sparks rained from fractured conduits. Robotic loaders zipped across narrow tracks, dragging ore-streaked slabs behind them. Zarium dust floated through the air like flecks of gold, beautiful if you didn't know it was killing you slowly. If you didn't see the burns it left on exposed skin, the way it made eyes red and teeth brittle. He found her in Zone 4B. Lysera was on her knees beside a mound of raw ore, sorting jagged chunks with gloved hands. Her breathing was shallow, labored, but her movements remained precise, deliberate. Around her, others struggled. Some had collapsed entirely. One young male slumped against a rock, unmoving, his skin blistered from contact with contaminated dust. And still she worked. But then, just for a second, he saw something that made his chest tighten. She pulled a worn nutrient bar from her satchel, the one Darren had hidden in the vent chute 2 nights ago. She didn't eat it. Instead, she reached out and slipped it into the hand of the collapsed boy beside her, pressing it into his fingers with a gentleness that felt out of place in a place like this. The boy stirred, and Lysera turned back to her work, slower now, like she'd just given away the last of her strength without a second thought. Darren looked away, his jaw clenched. That quiet act of defiance, of compassion, hit harder than any speech could have. She still had something inside her that Thalos 9 hadn't stolen, and he didn't know if that made her the strongest person here or the most doomed. Then the collapse happened. It began with a low, distant groan, a sound the station made only when it was too late to run. A pressure line ruptured above Zone 4C, cracking a load-bearing column and setting off a chain reaction. Walls trembled, lights blinked out. Somewhere a worker screamed, "Collapse! Collapse! Brace for—" A thunderous roar drowned the rest. Darren didn't think. He sprinted, his feet pounded the grated floor, metal rattling underfoot as he dodged falling beams and clouds of dust. A loader overturned in front of him, wheels spinning uselessly in the air. He found her near the edge of the fallout zone, half buried beneath a snapped support beam, chains tangled around a section of twisted pipe. The boy she had helped lay motionless beside her, pinned. Lysera was trying to lift the beam. Her arms trembled violently. Her lip was split, blood trailing down her chin. She didn't even seem to notice. "Lysera!" Darren shouted, his voice raw over the noise. She looked up, eyes wide, not with fear, but urgency. The boy was still breathing, but barely. "I can't move him," she said, her voice hoarse from dust. Darren dropped to one knee and pulled the torch from his belt. The beam was thick, reinforced. One wrong move, and it would crush them both. He started cutting. Sparks sprayed. The heat bit into his sleeves, singeing the fabric. The torch whined, struggling against the metal, but he didn't stop. Behind him, the wall creaked ominously. "You need to go," she said suddenly. "If they see you—" "I'm not leaving you," he snapped. She didn't argue again. The beam gave way with a final screech. Darren tossed it aside and dragged the boy out from beneath it. He wasn't bleeding badly. Shock, maybe. He'd survive. But Lysera was still stuck. The chain around her neck had fused to the debris. She winced as she tried to move. Blood seeped from a burn where the collar had cut into her skin. Darren swore under his breath and leaned over her. "I'm going to cut it," he said. "You have to hold still. You'll burn me." "I won't," he lied. He had to angle the torch carefully, shielding her with his own body. Sparks danced across his back and he bit down on a cry. The smell of melting steel and scorched cloth filled his nose. The chain snapped. She collapsed forward into his arms. Just for a second, she let herself lean into him. Her breath was ragged against his neck, and he could feel the tremble in her limbs, not from pain, but from release. They stayed like that for a moment longer than was safe. Then the emergency lights flickered back to life. The alarm ceased. Automated drones rolled in, scanning the wreckage. Darren stood, pulling her up gently with him. She didn't let go of his arm, and for the first time, he didn't want her to. No one said a word as they boarded the lift back to the upper decks. The boy clung to the rail, dazed but alive. Lysera stood beside Darren, her hand still brushing his. As the doors sealed and the platform began to rise, Darren glanced at the shadows near the far wall. There, just for a moment, he saw an overseer watching from the dark, expressionless. Still, then gone. His stomach turned. Someone had seen. But when he looked back at Lysera, she was watching him, not with fear, not with regret, with trust. Something had changed between them in the dark, and no matter what came next, Darren knew he would never walk away from her again. Darren didn't sleep. Not after what happened in the shaft. Not after the way she looked at him, trust, not fear, as the guards led her away. It had been hours since the collapse, yet the station still felt like it was shaking beneath his boots. He sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at the cold metal floor, the pain in his shoulder, a dull reminder of the chain he'd cut through to free her. The overhead light flickered like it couldn't decide whether to stay on or die out completely. Someone had seen. He knew that. He could feel it in the silence that followed the shift, the way the overseer spoke less, watched more. Thalos 9 didn't use words to punish. It used time, pressure, isolation. And if they suspected anything, it was only a matter of when. He didn't care. Not anymore. Lysera had trusted him, and that changed everything. That night, when the station's artificial dusk began its cycle, he left his bunk and made his way back to the old shaft vent where they'd met before. He didn't even check if he was being followed. There were no more cautious glances over his shoulder. He needed to see her. The corridor hissed with recycled air and the faint crackle of old conduits. Darren leaned against the wall, waiting, nerves tight as steel cables. The hum of machinery faded into the background as minutes passed. Then, movement. Lysera stepped into the shadows, her eyes immediately locking onto his. She looked exhausted. Her lip was healing, but her throat still showed faint bruises. There was no makeup, no covering up the damage on Thalos 9. You wore your wounds like a language. She didn't speak right away. Neither did he. Then she whispered, "You shouldn't have helped me." "I couldn't not," he replied. She let out a slow breath and leaned against the opposite wall, her arms wrapped loosely around herself. "I got lucky," she said. "They questioned me, nothing more. I said I was trying to save the boy. I think they believed it, or maybe I'm not worth punishing yet." "You are," he said quietly. Her head tilted slightly. "Worth it." That silenced the air between them. Then slowly, she moved closer. Not enough to alarm him, just enough to remind him that she was choosing to stand near. "I had an uncle," she said softly, "who worked the outer orbit mines near Helior. He used to send voice notes once a cycle. My sister and I would gather in the atrium and listen to his stories. We thought he was a starship captain." She smiled faintly, as if the memory hurt more than it comforted. "Turns out he died 3 months into his contract. Heat stroke. But the company kept sending old recordings from the databank, pretending he was alive, to keep the payments coming." Darren didn't say anything. "They trick you with paper and promises," she continued. "On Koran, we were farmers, orchards, climate-controlled domes. Heliox Industries gave us loans, new equipment, atmospheric buffers, soil enhancers, said it would raise our yield tenfold." He could hear the bitterness growing beneath her calm. "They didn't mention that the interest rates doubled every solar quarter. When our harvest failed, they sent collectors, said we owed more than we could ever repay." Her gaze hardened. "They offered us a labor relief program, said one able-bodied adult could work off the debt in 3 years. My parents didn't believe them, but I did." Darren took a breath. "You volunteered?" She nodded once. "I thought I could survive it, that I'd come back, and maybe I would have if it had been real. But there were no contracts, no rights, no end dates, just a number on a ledger. And the moment I stepped off the transport, I stopped being a person. The quiet between them was raw. I wasn't the only one," she said. 3 months later, they came for my sister." Darren's stomach twisted. She didn't volunteer. Lysera turned away slightly, her voice barely a whisper now. "I haven't seen her since." A long silence followed. He didn't fill it. He couldn't. But he reached out again, this time without hesitation. She let him. Their hands met, fingers curling together. It wasn't a romantic touch. It was something older than that. Something forged in fire and silence and shared loss. And then her voice came again, low but steady. "You know what Zarium really is?" Darren hesitated. "It powers drives, shields, some reactors. That's all I know." "That's what they tell you, but it's more than that." Her voice sharpened slightly. "It's the backbone of every quantum field manipulator across the expansion zones. It fuels planetary terraforming, weaponized navigation systems, hyperluminal drives, and you can't synthesize it. You're saying it's irreplaceable. I'm saying every colonization effort beyond the Perseus line depends on it. The empires don't just want it, they need it. And they're willing to mine it with lives instead of machines. Because bodies are cheaper to replace than tech. Darren felt cold. And Thalos 9? One of the largest Zarium extraction points in this sector. Not officially, of course. On paper, this station is just a salvage and refinement site. But down below, they're pulling raw veins straight from asteroid cores. We're not just mining, we're fueling expansion, war, everything. The air between them was heavier now. The shadows around them felt less like cover and more like chains. That's why they don't let us out, she finished. Because if word gets out about what they're doing down there, the system collapses. Darren looked at her and saw it then. Not just pain, not just resilience, but clarity. She wasn't naive. She wasn't holding out for rescue. She knew exactly what this place was, and she was still alive. He squeezed her hand gently. You asked me once why I kept showing up, he said. I think it's because I needed to see something that still refused to break. She gave a breathless laugh, eyes shimmering in the dark. And I needed someone to remind me what I was holding on for. They stood like that for a long moment, not moving, barely breathing, just two lives, tangled in the machinery of something vast and merciless, finding in each other the one thing the station couldn't crush, choice. And Darren knew, with absolute certainty, that this wasn't about survival anymore. It was about escape, not just from Thalos 9, but from the entire system built on people like her. Darren didn't look over his shoulder anymore. It wasn't courage, it was futility. He already knew they were being watched, not openly, not obviously, but the shift in the atmosphere was undeniable. Overseers now lingered in places they never used to. Questions were asked with too casual tones. Guards moved in twos instead of alone. They knew something. Maybe not the full truth. Maybe not enough to act, but enough to wait. He felt it every time he walked through the lower corridors, eyes tracking his steps from the upper catwalks. The tightness in conversations when he entered a room. The long pause before someone answered when he spoke. It was only a matter of time. And then the transfer order came. Not to him, not to Lucera, but he heard it whispered. An uncooperative worker flagged for reassignment to the outer rings. That was all it took. No one came back from the outer rings. You didn't get reassigned there. You disappeared into it, sliced apart by radiation exposure, machinery, or slow suffocation. It was the station's version of a death sentence, and they never had to admit it. That night, he found her in the vent corridor behind storage subsection D, where the pipes always hissed and the shadows lingered longer than they should. She was already there, waiting. Her arms were folded across her chest. Her eyes, usually so sharp, seemed tired, not defeated, but like someone who'd stopped hoping for reprieve and started calculating survival. They're transferring someone, she said as soon as he entered. He nodded. I heard. Her jaw tightened. It's me. I know it. I won't let them, he said. You might not have a choice. Darren stepped closer, lowering his voice. Then we make one. She looked up at him, searching his face for something. Doubt, fear, anything to hold on to. But he gave her nothing but certainty. I have a plan, he said. Her arms dropped slowly to her sides. How far along? Far enough to know it's possible, not far enough to be safe. Good, she said. Tell me everything. He did. Not in generalities, but in brutal, exacting detail. He explained the sub-hangar route, how he'd rerouted patrol drones on cycles with just a 22-second delay window, how he'd found an old maintenance shuttle, half-rusted but with a functional fusion core, buried beneath parts reclamation. How the next meteor burst would scramble the station's outer radar grid for 4 minutes, giving them just enough time to launch unnoticed, if the override codes held. She didn't interrupt once. When he finished, she exhaled slowly. You'll need to reprogram the shuttle's core signature. I know. No, you don't, she met his eyes. The override protocol you're thinking of is local. It won't fool the long-range beacon. They'll scan outbound traffic logs, even in a blind zone. He stared. You've done this before. I worked with transit modules back on Quran. Before this, her voice faltered, but she steadied it. I know their system's better than most people here. He smiled, just a little. Then we do it together. She nodded once. Together. They sat in silence for a moment, both of them pressed against the cold wall, shoulders nearly touching. Then she said, There's more. Darren glanced sideways. I think the overseer who saw us that night, the one during the collapse, I think he's waiting. For what? For a better reason to act. He's not reporting us yet because he's watching, waiting to see if we slip, if we're stupid enough to give him proof. Darren cursed under his breath. I knew he saw us. I saw him. Lysera's voice dropped to a whisper. There's another thing. She reached into her uniform, carefully unfolded a grimy scrap of thin metal. It was a work ledger plate, encrypted, standard issue. Every laborer was assigned one, embedded with their record, task logs, and identity signature. This belonged to one of the boys they pulled last week, she said. He dropped it during an inspection. I picked it up before anyone noticed. Why is that important? Because his profile is still in the system, and I can overwrite mine with it. Darren blinked. That means they won't know I'm gone, not right away. They'll think I'm still inside the labor pool. He stared at her for a beat, then let out a short, almost disbelieving laugh. You really thought this through. I've been thinking about it since my second week here, she said. You gave me a reason to act on it. He didn't know what to say to that, so he reached out. Their hands met in the middle, fingers slipping together with a familiarity that no longer felt strange. She squeezed once, firm, steady, but then she pulled back. There's something else. What? The boy. The one from the collapse. I saw him today. Darren tensed. Does he know? I think so. He wouldn't look at me, but he didn't report anything either. That's good, right? She hesitated. It's not loyalty, it's fear. Darren felt a cold shiver crawl down his back. You think they got to him? I think he's trying to survive. He nodded slowly. So are we. They stood there a while longer, quietly reviewing the steps ahead. Each route, each margin of error, each task that had to go perfectly. Then Darren said, we need to move fast. How fast? 2 cycles. The meteor burst is in 36 hours. Her expression didn't change, but he could see the weight of it settle into her posture. Then we have to start now, she said. He glanced at her, the faint glow from the pipe light catching the side of her face. She looked like something carved from dusk, worn, scarred, and still, luminous. You asked me once, she said quietly, if I was more than a reason to run. He nodded. I think I want to find out what I am when I'm free. He stepped closer, close enough that their breath shared the same space. We will, he said. Together. She leaned into him then, her forehead resting lightly against his. Not a kiss, not a confession, just contact, like 2 pieces of the same puzzle finally fitting. Darren closed his eyes, letting the moment settle around them like a promise. When they pulled apart, there were no final words. They simply walked away, each toward their role in what would come next. A mechanic, an engineer, 2 ghosts inside a system that no longer owned them. And in 36 hours, if everything went exactly right, they'd burn a hole through the belly of Thalos 9 and vanish into the stars, not as fugitives, but as something freer than the station could ever understand, as human, as Karani, as survivors, together. The last 36 hours had been a blur of silence, shadows, and calculation. Darren barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw failure. Guards dragging Lysera back into the mines, alarms screaming through the corridors, the escape shuttle torn apart before launch. But worse than any of those images was the thought of her gone, erased. Just another number wiped off the system without a trace. So instead of sleeping, he moved. He rewired drone paths. He mapped out fallback tunnels in case the hangar access collapsed. He taught himself how to override an engine fuse with a salvaged panel key. It wasn't about perfecting the plan anymore. It was about making sure there was no excuse for failure. Lysera worked just as hard. She returned from her shifts each night with intel. Who'd been reassigned, which corridors were being patrolled more heavily, which terminal screens had new access restrictions. She never asked if Darren could handle his part. She trusted him. That was the most dangerous part of it all. Not the escape, not the consequences. Her trust. And now, it was almost time. They had 4 hours left before the meteor burst would scatter the outer sensor grid, just enough time to slip through unnoticed. That's when everything changed. Darren was working on a faulty circuit panel outside maintenance deck 2 when the overhead lights dimmed, then flickered twice in rapid succession. Not a failure, a code, a warning. He froze. Seconds later, the station's automated voice came alive. Emergency atmospheric calibration engaged. Meteor shielding active. Sectors 2 through 9 entering lockdown. All personnel, clear restricted corridors immediately. Darren's heart stopped. Too early. It was supposed to happen in 4 hours. That meteor burst wasn't scheduled yet. unless someone had manually overridden the schedule, unless someone knew. He bolted down the access corridor, cutting through the ventway between Deck 4 and the sub-hangar. His boots slammed the grated floor, each echo pounding with rising panic. Had Lysera made it? Had someone already found her? He reached the side tunnel leading into Hangar 17, panting, sweat sliding down his back, and stopped cold. The Overseer was waiting there, alone. He stood calmly in the middle of the corridor, hands behind his back, head tilted slightly like a man waiting for a meeting, not an ambush. "I told them you wouldn't stop," he said, voice quiet, almost conversational. "I told them there's always one. A human who thinks sentiment is strength." Darren didn't move. Not yet. Not until he understood what was happening. The Overseer stepped closer, into the flickering light. "Did she tell you how many others tried this?" he asked. "How many workers? Karani, Hespari, even Terrans, made plans just like yours. How many ended up on the hull wall, oxygen drained, bodies drifting like trash?" Darren clenched his fists. "She's different," he said. The Overseer smiled faintly. "They all say that." And then he tilted his head, just slightly, toward a darkened, wall-mounted camera. Darren didn't have to look. He knew what it meant. They were being watched. "I hope," the Overseer said, turning half away, "you enjoyed your moment of defiance, Vale." He walked off. No guards. No arrest. Just a quiet retreat. It was worse than an ambush. It was permission. "Run," he was saying. "Let me enjoy the hunt." Darren didn't hesitate. He sprinted down the corridor and keyed in the hangar override. Lysera was already in the shuttle. The access ramp hissed open and he climbed inside, chest tight, breath ragged. "We're blown," he said. "The Overseer's coming. They're locking down everything." She didn't panic, didn't even flinch. "I'm already in launch prep," she said, flicking switches, routing power through the auxiliary couplings. "Fusion core is hot. Navigation synced. Transponder scrubbed? Halfway. You do the rest. I'm opening the cargo release. Engines are primed." They worked like a machine. Darren dropped into the pilot seat and input the final ignition codes. Lysera moved to the rear access shaft and disconnected the emergency beacon manually. The shuttle groaned beneath them, metal creaking as it powered up. Then the comm system sparked. A voice filtered through. The Overseer's voice. "You always had potential, Vale. You could have risen far in the system. But you chose loyalty. How quaint." Lysera returned, wiping sweat from her brow. "Let him talk," she said. Darren keyed in the launch command. Error. Clamps still engaged. "I'll cut them," she said. "Lysera, no time. You fly. I finish this." She disappeared into the belly of the ship with the plasma cutter. Outside, the hangar lights dimmed, then flared red. A drone entered the bay, then another, then 5. Darren swore. He activated the blast shield, sealing the cockpit. The external monitors lit up with motion. Drones fanning out, scanning the shuttle, trying to break the code lock. He opened the external cam feed, and what he saw stopped him. The boy. The one from the collapse. He was crouched behind a maintenance cart, watching everything. Then, he ran. Straight at one of the drones. He screamed, picked up a broken pipe, and threw it. Hard. The drone turned to face him, fired a non-lethal stun charge. The boy collapsed instantly, but he'd drawn attention away. Darren's throat locked. Clunk. The clamps released. Lysera's voice crackled through the comm. "Now, Vale." He didn't wait. He slammed the throttle. The shuttle roared upward. The drones scattered. The hangar ceiling split open. A last-second alert flashed. Launch gate override initiated. Remote system attempting closure. "They're trying to seal us in." Lysera bolted into the cockpit. "Manual control," she shouted. They both grabbed the yoke and pushed it forward together. The shuttle screamed through the narrow breach just as the doors began to close. Metal scraped against the hull. A wing clipped the upper gate. The shuttle spun, hard, but Darren righted it mid-roll. Then, nothing. Silence. Starlight. The black. Thalos 9 shrank behind them, tiny and distant and meaningless now. Darren eased back on the controls. The hum of the engines dropped to a whisper. The readings showed clear space. "We did it," he said softly. Lysera sank into the co-pilot seat, chest rising and falling. "They'll chase us," she said. "Let them," he replied. "They'll never catch us now." And for the first time in his life, Darren Vale wasn't afraid of the dark. He welcomed it. Because for the first time, It belonged to him, to her, to them. They had torn themselves free, and no one, not overseers, not contracts, not a damn corporation would ever chain them again. Not now, not ever. Space had a sound, at least inside your own mind. Not silence, not really. More like a low hum that wrapped around the bones, pulsing with the weight of everything that had just been risked. Darren sat slumped in the pilot's seat, his hands still on the controls, even though the shuttle was coasting silently through space. The stars outside weren't the distant pinpricks of light he used to see through the filtered windows of Thalos 9. They were real now, vivid, endless, free. He didn't move, couldn't. His whole body was buzzing from the adrenaline crash, his pulse slowly normalizing. Every muscle ached like he just fought gravity itself. Maybe in a way, he had. Behind him, Lysera paced the length of the cockpit slowly, methodically. Her steps were uneven, exhaustion, or pain, or both. She hadn't said much since they'd broken through the hangar doors. Just worked, checked readouts, ran systems, reconnected oxygen cycling. Neither of them spoke for several long minutes. Then Darren finally turned his head, slow as molasses. His voice came out hoarse. "We made it." Lysera looked at him. Her eyes weren't wide with shock. They weren't even tired. They were sharp, present. "Yes," she said. "We did." He gave a short, almost disbelieving laugh. "I didn't think," he started, but the words died on his tongue. She came closer, crouched beside him. "I did." That stopped him. She added more softly, "The second I saw your hands shake in the tunnels. Not from fear, because you were angry. You cared." "I still do," he said, more serious now. They were quiet again, the stars turning slowly beyond the cockpit. Then the console flickered weakly. A long-range ping. Darren reached for it, but Lysera stopped him with a hand on his wrist. "Don't," she said. "It's not pursuit, not yet." He looked at her, confused. "If we answer it, we become real again," she explained. "Trackable, known. What is it?" She shrugged. "Could be an old colony signal, could be nothing, could be bait." He hesitated, then slowly pulled his hand back from the screen. The signal faded into static. They were ghosts now. It was safer that way. Still, something gnawed at Darren. He glanced at the co-pilot display. The nav system was operating on auxiliary power. Life support was stable, but fragile. The shuttle was drifting toward the outer rim of a nearby asteroid belt. A good place to hide, but also a dangerous place to stop for long. "We'll need to pick a direction," he said finally. Lysera didn't respond right away. She was staring out the front viewport, her expression unreadable. "Do you think they'll come after us?" she asked. "I know they will." "But not now," he nodded. "Not now." Her jaw tightened slightly. "Then this is our window. Before they rebuild, before they shift their attention outward again." Darren frowned. "You're talking like this isn't over." "It's not," she said, standing and walking slowly back to the systems console. "We got out. That's just the first step." He followed her with his eyes. "You're thinking about going back." "Not to Thalos," she said quickly. "Not directly, but there are others out there, like me, like you." He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. "You want to become some kind of rescue operation?" "I want to become something they can't erase." That sentence landed between them like a declaration. Darren sat with it, let it echo, and then nodded. "Then we need to give ourselves a name." She turned her head toward him. "What?" "This ship, United States. What we are now." Lysera considered it. She moved back to the console and opened the beacon ID field, the one they'd wiped clean during their escape. The name field blinked blank. She typed slowly, "Koran's Dawn." He read it aloud. "Koran's Dawn?" Her voice was softer now. "My home was supposed to die quiet, buried under silence and debt. But this," she gestured to the stars outside, "this is proof it didn't." Darren nodded. "A beginning," he said. She turned to face him fully. "We've earned it." The silence that followed was no longer cold. It felt warm, shared. And then, a crackling on the comms, a garbled voice. "Repeat, unidentified vessel. Please confirm identification." Darren moved to mute it, but Lysera stopped him. "Wait," the voice came again. "This is Outer Patrol Station 8 Beta. We registered a beacon signature, Koran's Dawn. If you are in distress, respond." He looked at her. She looked back, and for a moment neither moved. Then she reached out, flipped the comm on. "This is Koran's Dawn," she said clearly. The channel buzzed. Then, acknowledged. Coordinates received. You're clear to enter approach vector 32 Charlie. Welcome, wherever you came from. They stared at each other. It wasn't over, but it was beginning. Darren reached across the console and took her hand. Not desperate, not afraid, just steady. She squeezed once and smiled. A real smile, the first he'd ever seen from her. And it made every scar, every bruise, every moment of darkness they'd clawed through worth it. Not because they'd escaped, but because now they were finally alive. Together. A few minutes passed with nothing but the soft hum of drifting systems and the distant throb of the fusion core cooling behind them. Navigation finished aligning. Darren noticed Lysera staring at something on her personal terminal. A flickering hollow image, edges degraded with age. It showed a younger version of her, standing between a tall man with a farming tool in one hand and a woman with dark, striking eyes. Her family. Your family? He asked softly. She nodded, but her expression didn't change. Last image I had before they took me. I don't even know if they're alive. Darren said nothing. I need to know, she added. Even if I never set foot on Quran again, I have to know. He reached across the console and gently took her hand. We'll find them, he said. No hesitation, no doubt. She didn't thank him. Instead, she looked at him for a long, quiet moment, and then she leaned forward and pressed her lips against his. It wasn't desperate. It wasn't a goodbye. It was real. A kiss without urgency, without fear, just presence. When she pulled back, her forehead rested lightly against his, her breath warm against his skin. I love you, she whispered. Darren's hand came up to her cheek, steady and certain. I love you too. They stayed like that, forehead to forehead, suspended in quiet gravity, not because they needed comfort, but because for the first time they had someone to hold on to, someone to come back to, and for both of them that meant everything. The sky above Quran was no longer the vibrant lavender Lysera remembered. It hung low and pale, bruised by years of neglect and orbital dust. Winds swept over cracked soil and broken dome frames, whispering through the bones of a world once alive with harvest and laughter. Nothing looked the same, but the ache in her chest told her this was still home. Beneath the silence, something had survived. They walked through the cracked valley dome, past dead irrigation lines and broken housing frames. The sun on Quran was dimmer now, filtered through atmosphere dust and thin cloud, but it still warmed Lysera's skin like it remembered her. And then, the greenhouse, still standing. Its roof was patched together with salvaged glass and pressure seals. Old solar panels lined the top like battle armor. Inside, a figure moved, hunched, slow, careful. Lysera froze mid-step. Darren stopped beside her, watching her shoulders rise and fall. She stepped forward. The figure inside turned slowly at the creak of the outer door. Her father. His face was thinner, his skin more weathered, hair streaked in pale gray, but his eyes didn't change. They went wide, disbelieving. Then he whispered like the wind had stolen most of his voice. Lysera? She didn't speak. She just ran. He dropped the shears he was holding, stumbling toward her, and when they met in the middle of the greenhouse, she crashed into his arms so hard he staggered back and held her like he would never let go again. There was no formality, no words left to say. Only that hug, that impossible, shaking, sob-soaked embrace. And then, from deeper inside the greenhouse, another voice, softer, more fragile, rose into the air. A woman stepped forward, shorter, wrapped in patched cloth robes. Her hair, long and silver, hung loose over her shoulders, and her hands trembled as they reached up to cover her mouth. Lysera, the woman breathed. Lysera turned, slowly. The sound that came out of her was a sob, but deeper, a sound of grief and joy colliding all at once. Mother. She didn't run this time. She walked carefully, like she was afraid the moment might break if she moved too fast. But her mother didn't wait. She crossed the floor and folded her daughter into her arms, burying her face into Lysera's shoulder, shaking with every breath. Her body was smaller than Lysera remembered, frailer, but her grip was strong, and Lysera, the woman who had endured years of captivity without shedding a single tear, broke completely. Tears streamed silently down her face, falling onto her mother's robe as her hands gripped the back of her mother's neck and held on like a child lost in the dark. I thought I'd never see you again, Lysera whispered. Her mother only nodded into her shoulder, her own voice hoarse with grief. Every night I begged the sky to bring you back. Her father joined them again, his arms around them both, and for the first time in what felt like lifetimes, Lysera stood in the middle of the family she thought she'd lost, and wept. Darren didn't approach. He stood outside the doorway of the greenhouse, hands in his pockets, watching quietly as something sacred unfolded in front of him. He had never known what family meant before, but this was it. Darren fixed the filtration lines. Lysera rebuilt the irrigation systems. Eventually, the greenhouse doubled in size. Then, one night weeks later, while planting roots in the dome, they heard a signal ping through the comm array. A soft, low-band burst, untraceable. A voice, a laugh. "Is this thing working?" Lysera, her sister's voice, alive, calling home. Lysera dropped to her knees, covering her mouth with both hands. Darren put an arm around her shoulder and held her until she could breathe again. They answered. And days later, a ship arrived. Not large, not sleek, but it carried a woman with eyes just like Lysera's. The reunion was louder than the first. Her sister ran straight from the airlock into Lysera's arms, sobbing and laughing all at once. They held each other in a way that looked more like memory than movement, like time folded just for them, collapsing every year of absence into one breathless, shaking moment. Their mother cried again, even their father did, and this time the joy was unbroken.